deep in the wilderness, where cell towers don't reach and the nearest neighbor is miles away. Something sinister lurks in the shadows of America's most isolated cabins. Tonight, we're diving into 11 documented cases that will make you think twice about that peaceful weekend retreat. From the Montana mountains, where security cameras captured something living in the walls, to the Canadian Rockies, where ham radio operators received transmissions from a cabin that was already empty, each story will leave you questioning what really happens when civilization disappears behind you. Fair warning, some of these accounts are so disturbing that the people involved have never returned to the woods again. Let's move to our first story. Our first case takes us to Pine Ridge, Montana, in March of 2019, where what started as a romantic getaway for Harper and Mason Williams became a nightmare that still haunts them today. I spoke with Harper directly over the phone last month, and her voice still trembles when she recalls those 3 days that changed how she views privacy, safety, and trust forever. This isn't just a story about a stalker. It's about the terrifying realization that someone had been planning, watching, and waiting for the perfect victims to arrive at what they thought was their private sanctuary. Harper and Mason had been together for 2 years and were looking for a quiet place to celebrate their anniversary away from the chaos of Denver. They found what seemed like the perfect Airbnb listing. A beautifully renovated log cabin nestled in the Bitterroot Mountains, surrounded by towering pines and complete isolation. The photos showed a cozy interior with a stone fireplace, modern amenities, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the wilderness. The host, listed as David M., had 5-star reviews spanning back 3 years, with guests consistently praising the property's cleanliness, amenities, and the host's responsiveness. The cabin was located 14 miles from the nearest town on a private dirt road, accessible only by 4-wheel drive during the winter months. For Harper and Mason, it was exactly what they were looking for: complete privacy and a chance to disconnect from the world. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in late March, when snow still dusted the higher elevations and the air carried that crisp mountain bite that made every breath feel cleaner. The cabin exceeded their expectations. Everything was exactly as advertised. The kitchen was fully stocked, the hot tub on the back deck was already heated and ready, and David had even left a bottle of wine with a welcome note. The first evening passed perfectly. They cooked dinner together, sat by the fire, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the pine trees. It was Harper who first noticed something was wrong the next morning. She woke up around 7 and went to the kitchen to make coffee, but stopped when she saw the refrigerator, the bottle of wine they'd opened the night before. She was certain they'd left it on the counter with about a third remaining. Now it was gone, and when she opened the refrigerator, there it was, properly stored with a cork in it. Mason insisted he must have put it away before bed, but Harper knew he hadn't. She'd been the last one in the kitchen, and she specifically remembered leaving it out because they'd planned to finish it the next evening. It was a small thing, easily explained away, but it planted a seed of unease that would only grow. The second night, Harper woke up around 3 in the morning to a sound she couldn't immediately identify. It was rhythmic, like someone gently tapping on wood, but irregular. 3 taps, pause, 5 taps, pause, 2 taps. She lay there listening for several minutes, trying to determine where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be traveling around the perimeter of the cabin, starting from what she thought was the kitchen area, moving toward the bedroom, then disappearing entirely. When she mentioned it to Mason the next morning, he suggested it was probably the house settling or maybe a woodpecker. But Harper had grown up in Colorado and knew the difference between natural forest sounds and something else entirely. That second day, they decided to explore the property. The cabin sat on about 5 acres of partially cleared land, with dense forest on 3 sides and a small meadows opening to the south. As they walked the boundary line, Mason noticed something odd about the trees nearest to the cabin. Several of them had what looked like small metal fixtures screwed into the bark at about eye level. Tiny brackets that could have held cameras or other equipment. When he pointed them out to Harper, she felt that same unease from the morning before, but amplified. David hadn't mentioned any security system in the listing, and these fixtures looked freshly installed with new screws and no weathering on the metal. They cut their exploration short and returned to the cabin, where Harper immediately began checking the interior more carefully. She found the first camera behind a decorative plant on the kitchen windowsill. A tiny wireless device no bigger than a coin, perfectly camouflaged among the leaves. Mason found the second one built into what looked like a smoke detector in the living room, though when he examined it closely, he realized it was a fake detector that was only housing surveillance equipment. By the time they'd searched the entire cabin, they'd found 6 cameras total: bedroom, bathroom, living room, kitchen, and 2 exterior cameras they'd initially missed. But the cameras weren't the worst discovery. While Mason was calling the police, Harper decided to check the basement, which had been advertised as a storage area they wouldn't need to access. The door was locked, but she found the key in the kitchen junk drawer labeled basement. What she discovered down there made her physically sick. The basement had been converted into what could only be described as a surveillance command center. 3 computer monitors showed live feeds from not just their cabin, but from what appeared to be several other rental properties. Hard drives were stacked along one wall, labeled with dates going back months. A filing cabinet contained printed photographs of previous guests, hundreds of them, taken without their knowledge during intimate moments. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed dossier with Harper and Mason's names on it. Someone had researched them extensively before their arrival. The folder contained printouts of their social media profiles, their work addresses, their daily routines, even photos of their apartment building in Denver. Notes in the margins indicated the person had been watching them for weeks before they'd even booked the cabin. One note, written in red ink, simply said, "Perfect candidates, isolated, trusting, minimal family contact during trip." But here's where the story takes an even more sinister turn. When the police arrived, which took nearly 2 hours due to the remote location, they discovered that David M. didn't exist. The Airbnb account had been created with stolen identity documents, and the property wasn't even supposed to be available for rental. The real owner was an elderly man named Frank Sorensen, who lived in Florida and had no idea his inherited Montana property was being used for this purpose. Someone had been illegally operating this surveillance operation for years, using fake rental listings to lure victims to the property. The basement also contained evidence that suggested Harper and Mason weren't the first victims to discover the setup. Police found what appeared to be a hastily destroyed hard drive and several empty folders labeled with dates from the previous month. Security footage from the exterior cameras, which the perpetrator apparently forgot to delete, showed a figure moving around the property during the early morning hours of Harper and Mason's first night. The same time Harper had heard the tapping sounds, the footage revealed someone had been watching them through the windows, documenting their routines, and even entering the cabin while they slept to rearrange items and plant additional recording devices. Detective Maria Santos, who led the investigation, told Harper that in her 20 years of law enforcement, she'd never seen such a methodical, long-term stalking operation. The level of preparation and technical sophistication suggested someone with significant resources and experience. The perpetrator had created multiple fake rental accounts across several platforms, had professional-grade surveillance equipment, and had been operating this scheme for potentially years without detection. What made it even more troubling was that they'd specifically targeted couples who fit certain criteria: young, tech-savvy, likely to document their trip on social media, and planning romantic getaways where they'd be distracted and vulnerable. Harper told me that the worst part wasn't discovering the cameras or even finding the dossier with their personal information. It was the realization that someone had been in their bedroom while they slept, had watched them during their most intimate moments, and had been planning something that she and Mason had unknowingly interrupted by discovering the surveillance too early. Police found evidence suggesting the perpetrator had been building toward some kind of direct confrontation, possibly during their final night at the property. The case remains open today. Despite extensive investigation, the person behind this operation was never identified or caught. The property has been seized as evidence, but authorities suspect similar operations may be running at other remote rental properties across the Mountain West. Harper and Mason have never returned to Montana, and Harper admits she can no longer stay in any remote rental property without conducting her own thorough search for surveillance equipment first. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how it highlights the vulnerability we accept when we seek isolation and privacy. The very things that made the cabin attractive to Harper and Mason, the remoteness, the privacy, the lack of neighbors, were exactly what made them perfect targets for someone who had turned hospitality into a hunting ground. Let's move to our second story. Our second case takes us back to August of 1987, to the dense wilderness of Mendocino National Forest in Northern California, where what park rangers discovered at an isolated cabin has never been satisfactorily explained, despite decades of investigation and multiple theories from experts in fields ranging from psychology to atmospheric science. This isn't a case about what someone did. It's about what appears to be impossible, documented by multiple witnesses and preserved in official Park Service records that I was able to access through a Freedom of Information Act request filed last year. Ranger Thomas Kellerman had been patrolling the backcountry trails of Mendocino National Forest for 12 years when he made the discovery that would define the remainder of his career and haunt him long after his retirement. On August 15, 1987, Kellerman was conducting a routine patrol along the remote northern section of the forest, checking on registered campsites and ensuring compliance with fire regulations during what had been an unusually dry summer. The area he was patrolling was accessible only by foot or horseback, located roughly 18 miles from the nearest road and 43 miles from the small town of Covelo. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Kellerman came across a small log cabin that wasn't supposed to exist according to his maps. The structure appeared to be privately owned, but was located within the boundaries of National Forest land, which should have made its presence illegal. As he approached to investigate, he noticed smoke rising from the chimney and could smell what he later described as Sunday dinner cooking. Roasted meat and vegetables with herbs that reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen. The cabin appeared well maintained, with a small vegetable garden showing signs of recent tending and firewood neatly stacked along the exterior wall. Kellerman knocked on the door and called out, identifying himself as a park ranger, but received no response. The windows were covered with curtains from the inside, making it impossible to see into the cabin, but he could hear what sounded like a radio playing softly and the occasional creak of footsteps on wooden floors. After waiting several minutes and calling out multiple times, he decided to circle the property to look for the owners, assuming they might be working in the garden or gathering firewood nearby. What he found instead defied immediate explanation. The cabin sat in a perfect circle of absolute silence, while the surrounding forest was alive with the typical sounds of late summer: birds calling, insects buzzing, small animals moving through the underbrush. Within approximately 50 feet of the cabin, there was complete quiet. No wind moved the leaves on the trees closest to the structure. No insects could be heard, and even his own footsteps seemed muffled as he approached the building. Kellerman later wrote in his official report that the silence was so complete, it felt oppressive, like being inside a soundproofed room. When he returned to the front door, Kellerman noticed that the smoke from the chimney had stopped, though he could still smell cooking food. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Park Service regulations required him to enter and investigate any unauthorized structures on federal land. So he stepped inside what he would later describe as a scene that looked like it had been frozen in time mid-activity. The interior of the cabin was immaculately maintained and felt lived in, but completely empty of people. A fire was burning brightly in the stone fireplace, with fresh logs that showed no signs of burning down. On the kitchen table, 4 place settings were arranged with what appeared to be a complete family dinner. Roasted chicken that was still steaming, mashed potatoes with butter that hadn't yet melted, green beans that were perfectly cooked but still hot, and fresh bread that was warm to the touch. Each plate had been served as if the family had just stepped away from the table. But the food showed no signs of cooling or congealing. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the cabin in a way that suggested recent activity. In the living room, a book lay open on the arm of a chair with reading glasses beside it, as if someone had just looked up from reading. A child's coloring book was open on the floor with crayons scattered around it, and one crayon, a red one, appeared to have been dropped mid-stroke, leaving an incomplete circle on the page. In the kitchen, coffee was still brewing in a percolator, and when Kellerman tested it, the coffee was perfectly hot and fresh. The bedrooms told the same story. 2 children's beds were unmade, as if the occupants had just gotten up for the day. Clothes were laid out on one bed, as if someone had been selecting an outfit. In the master bedroom, the bed was neatly made, but a woman's jewelry box was open with several pieces laid out on the dresser, and a man's watch sat beside a water glass that was still full and showed no dust or settling. What made the scene even more unsettling was the evidence of a normal family routine interrupted midstream. In the bathroom, toothbrushes were wet, and a tube of toothpaste had been left uncapped with a small amount still squeezed out on the sink. Towels were damp and hanging as if recently used. The shower stall showed water droplets that were still beaded on the walls, suggesting someone had showered within the hour. Kellerman immediately radioed for backup and began documenting everything he could see. Ranger Supervisor James Mitchell arrived approximately 90 minutes later with 2 additional rangers, and all 4 men witnessed the same phenomena. The food remained hot, the fire continued to burn without consuming the logs, and the absolute silence around the property persisted. Mitchell later wrote in his supplementary report that he had never encountered anything like it in 23 years of Park Service work. The Rangers began a systematic search of the property and surrounding area, looking for any sign of the family that clearly lived in the cabin. They found evidence of recent activity everywhere. Fresh tire tracks leading to and from the cabin, footprints around the property that appeared to have been made within hours, and even fresh garbage in a can outside the back door that included that morning's breakfast dishes. But there were no footprints leading away from the cabin, no sign that anyone had left the property on foot, and no indication of where a family of 4 could have disappeared to in the middle of preparing and eating a meal. The search expanded over the following days to include helicopter sweeps, search dogs, and volunteers from the local community. The missing family was identified through personal items in the cabin as the Hendersons. Robert, age 34, his wife Patricia, age 31, and their children Emma, age 8, and David, age 5. The family had been renting the cabin from a private owner who had grandfathered rights to the property from before the land became part of the national forest. According to the owner, an elderly man named Carl Voss, who lived in San Francisco, the Hendersons had rented the cabin for 2 weeks and were scheduled to check out the following Sunday. Voss confirmed that he had spoken with Robert Henderson by phone just 3 days before the discovery, and everything had seemed normal. The family had been enjoying their vacation. The children were having fun exploring the woods, and they were planning to stay for the full 2 weeks. There had been no mention of any problems, concerns, or plans to leave early. What made the case even more puzzling was the forensic evidence, or rather, the lack thereof. When crime scene investigators arrived from the state police, they found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, and no indication that the family had been forced to leave against their will. All of their belongings remained in the cabin, including wallets with cash and credit cards, car keys, and suitcases that were still packed as if they planned to stay for the remainder of their vacation. The family's car was found parked behind the cabin exactly where it should be, with no mechanical problems and a nearly full tank of gas. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators examined the cabin more closely. Every clock in the house, and there were 7 of them, had stopped at exactly 1:47 p.m. on August 15th. The battery-powered clocks had functional batteries, the wind-up clocks were properly wound, and even the electric clocks showed the same time, despite the fact that the cabin's power came from a generator that was still running normally. When investigators reset the clocks, they began keeping accurate time immediately. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist brought in to consult on the case, noted several anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional disappearance scenarios. The positioning of personal items suggested that each family member had been engaged in normal activities when whatever happened occurred. There were no signs of panic, no evidence that anyone had tried to gather belongings or prepared to leave quickly, and no indication that the family had received any kind of warning or threat that might have caused them to flee. The case generated significant media attention and numerous theories. Some investigators suspected foul play despite the lack of evidence, theorizing that someone had carefully staged the scene to cover up kidnapping or murder. Others suggested the family had been part of some kind of witness protection relocation and had been extracted by federal agents, though no evidence supported this theory. More exotic explanations included everything from alien abduction to spontaneous dimensional displacement. Theories that gained credibility primarily because conventional explanations seemed inadequate. What happened to the Henderson family remains unknown today, nearly 4 decades later. The cabin was eventually demolished by the Park Service in 1994. But according to Kellerman, who continued to patrol that area until his retirement in 2003, the circle of silence persisted around the property site for years after the structure was removed. He reported that wildlife avoided the area, plants grew differently within the circle, and the oppressive quiet continued to affect visitors to the site. The official Park Service file on the Henderson disappearance remains open, though it's been transferred to the Cold Case Division. The case represents one of the most thoroughly documented, unexplained disappearances in national park history, with multiple witness statements, extensive forensic analysis, and detailed photographic evidence of the scene as it was discovered. Yet despite all this documentation, investigators are no closer to understanding what happened to the Henderson family than they were on that August afternoon in 1987, when Ranger Kellerman first knocked on the door of a cabin that shouldn't have been silent. Let's move to our third story. Our third case takes us to the remote wilderness of Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. During the brutal winter of January 2023, story comes to us through the recovered journal of Maya Blackwood, a 28-year-old freelance photographer from Toronto, who embarked on what she called a spiritual reset solo retreat. that became a documented descent into psychological horror. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that we have Maya's own words, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, chronicling her transformation from a confident outdoors woman into something barely recognizable as human by the time rescue teams found her. Maya had been planning this winter retreat for months. An experienced hiker and cold weather camper, she felt confident in her ability to handle a 2-week solo stay in a remote cabin she'd rented through Parks Canada. The cabin, designated as Backcountry Unit 47, was located approximately 32 kilometers from the nearest road, accessible only by snowshoe or cross-country skiing during the winter months. Maya had packed meticulously. Enough food for 3 weeks, a satellite communication device for emergencies, professional-grade winter gear, and multiple backup heating sources. She'd informed the Park Service of her planned itinerary and had arranged for a check-in call every 3 days. The journal begins on January 8th with entries that reflect Maya's excitement and sense of peace. She wrote about the pristine beauty of the snow-covered landscape, the satisfying physical challenge of the trek to the cabin, and her anticipation of 2 weeks of uninterrupted solitude to work on her photography and reconnect with herself. The cabin was exactly what she'd expected. A basic but well-maintained structure with a wood-burning stove, propane cooking facilities, and enough space for one person to live comfortably. Her early entries describe productive days spent snowshoeing, photographing winter wildlife, and enjoying the profound silence of the wilderness. By January 12th, subtle changes begin to appear in Maya's writing. She mentions having difficulty sleeping, attributing it to the absolute darkness of the winter nights and the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. She writes about hearing what she assumes are wolves or coyotes howling in the distance, but notes that the sounds seem to be coming from different directions each night, as if they're circling the cabin. She also mentions that her appetite has decreased, which she initially attributes to the lower activity level of being confined to the cabin during particularly cold days when the temperature dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. January 15th marks the first significant shift in tone. Maya writes about waking up to find her food cache disturbed, with several items missing or moved around. She initially suspects mice or other small animals, but can't find any droppings or other evidence of rodent activity. More concerning, she reports that her emergency radio has been acting strangely, picking up what sounds like human voices speaking in a language she can't identify, though the voices only come through late at night and fade in and out as if the speakers are moving around the cabin. She attempts to make her scheduled check-in call, but finds that her satellite device isn't connecting properly. The entries from January 18th reveal Maya's growing paranoia and confusion. Her handwriting becomes noticeably shakier, and she begins writing about seeing shadows moving outside the windows during the day, despite the fact that there shouldn't be anyone else in the area for dozens of kilometers. She describes feeling constantly watched and reports that she started barricading the door at night with furniture. Most troubling, she writes about food disappearing at an alarming rate, far more than could be explained by small animals. Yet she has no memory of eating the missing items and feels like she's barely eating anything at all. By January 21st, Maya's mental state has clearly deteriorated significantly. Her entries become repetitive and obsessive, filled with detailed descriptions of her daily rationing system and increasingly elaborate theories about who or what might be stealing her food. She writes about setting traps and staying awake all night to catch the thief, but always falls asleep before dawn and wakes to find more food missing. Her handwriting becomes increasingly erratic, with some words traced over multiple times and others barely legible. She begins referring to herself in the third person and describes watching herself from outside her body during daily activities. The most disturbing entries begin on January 24th, when Maya starts writing about the hunger. She describes a gnawing, constant sensation that food cannot satisfy, no matter how much she eats. Yet simultaneously, she reports that she can barely force herself to consume even small amounts of food, as if her body is rejecting nourishment. She begins writing about dreams where she's hunting and eating raw meat. Dreams so vivid that she wakes with the taste of blood in her mouth. She describes feeling stronger and more alert during these episodes, as if the imagined consumption is somehow more satisfying than actual food. January 27th's entry is written in what appears to be a different handwriting entirely. Still Maya's, but more primitive, with letters that look almost carved into the paper rather than written. She describes hearing voices calling to her from the forest, voices that sound like her own, but are speaking words she doesn't remember saying. She writes about an overwhelming urge to go outside and join the hunt, though she can't explain what this means. Most chilling, she describes looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back at her. Someone with hollow eyes, protruding bones, and teeth that seem sharper than they should be. The final legible entry, dated January 30th, is barely coherent. Maya writes about the others who live in the forest and have been waiting for her to become like them. She describes feeling her humanity slipping away and being replaced by something ancient and hungry. The entry ends mid-sentence with the words, "They're calling again, and this time I think I'll answer, because the hunger is too strong, and she's not strong enough to keep me inside anymore. And outside there's so much." The rest of the page is covered with scratches and marks that might be letters, but are impossible to read. Maya was found on February 2nd by a Parks Canada search and rescue team that had been dispatched when she failed to make her scheduled check-in calls. The rescue team, led by veteran park warden Derek Thompson, later described finding Maya in a state unlike anything they'd encountered in decades of wilderness rescue operations. She was discovered approximately 800 meters from the cabin, barely clothed despite the sub-zero temperatures, and appeared to have been surviving outdoors for several days. Her body weight had dropped dramatically, yet she seemed to possess unnatural strength and energy. What disturbed the rescue team most was Maya's behavior when they found her. She was crouched beside the frozen carcass of a deer and appeared to have been feeding on it with her bare hands and teeth. When the rescuers approached, she initially didn't seem to recognize them as human, responding to their voices with growls and backing away, as if they were predators competing for her food. It took several hours and the intervention of a park psychiatrist via radio communication before Maya began to respond to human speech and allowed herself to be helped. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the psychiatrist who evaluated Maya after her rescue, diagnosed her with severe malnutrition-induced psychosis complicated by prolonged isolation and what appeared to be symptoms consistent with Wendigo psychosis, a rare condition documented primarily in First Nations communities where individuals become convinced they must consume human flesh to survive. Dr. Walsh noted that Maya's physical condition was paradoxical. She showed signs of severe malnutrition and should have been too weak to survive outdoors, yet possessed unusual strength and energy that couldn't be medically explained. The cabin investigation revealed evidence that supported some of Maya's journal entries while contradicting others. Her food supplies had indeed been depleted much faster than should have been possible for one person. But there was no evidence of other humans or large animals accessing the cabin. The radio equipment was found to be functioning normally, with no record of the mysterious transmissions Maya had described. Most puzzling, the cabin showed signs of abandonment that suggested Maya had been gone for much longer than the few days the rescue team had assumed. Dishes were covered with a layer of dust, and the wood stove had been cold for what appeared to be at least a week. Maya spent 6 weeks in psychiatric treatment, gradually recovering her sense of identity and her memory of normal human behavior patterns. However, she retained no clear recollection of the final week at the cabin or how she had survived outdoors in sub-zero temperatures with minimal clothing and no shelter. She described feeling as if she had been possessed by something that wasn't human, and reported persistent cravings for raw meat that took months of therapy to overcome. The case attracted attention from researchers studying isolation-induced psychosis and the psychological effects of extreme survival situations. Dr. Robert Chen, a specialist in wilderness psychology, noted that Maya's case represented an extreme example of how the human mind can adapt to perceived threats by abandoning normal behavioral patterns and adopting what the subconscious interprets as more effective survival strategies, even when those strategies are objectively harmful. Maya has never returned to wilderness camping and has relocated to a densely populated urban area where she works in digital marketing. She's shared her journal with researchers in hopes that studying her experience might help others avoid similar psychological breaks. The cabin where she stayed has been temporarily removed from the Parks Canada rental system, while officials review safety protocols for solo winter stays in extreme isolation. What makes Maya's case particularly haunting is how her own words document the gradual dissolution of her identity and her transformation into something that existed purely to satisfy an endless, supernatural hunger that no amount of food could satisfy. Her journal serves as a terrifying reminder that in the deepest wilderness, the greatest threat may not come from external predators, but from the primitive survival instincts that still lurk within the human psyche, waiting for the right conditions to emerge and take control. Let's move to our fourth story. Our fourth case brings us to the dense forests of Blackwood Creek, Idaho, in September of 2021, where a routine hunting trip became a 3-day nightmare that transformed 4 experienced outdoorsmen into traumatized survivors of an encounter they still struggle to describe. What makes this case particularly compelling is that we have actual 911 call transcripts, deputy response logs, and physical evidence that corroborates one of the most terrifying creature encounters ever documented by law enforcement. The hunting party's ordeal was captured in real time through frantic emergency calls that reveal something systematically hunting them with an intelligence and persistence that defied every conventional explanation. The hunting party consisted of 4 longtime friends from Boise. Alexander Morrison, 35, a construction foreman with over 15 years of hunting experience. Chris Valdez, 38, an Iraq war veteran who worked as a security consultant. Liam Chen, 32, a wildlife biologist with the Idaho Fish and Game Department. And Tom Bradley, 41, a local sheriff's deputy who had taken vacation time for the trip. These weren't weekend warriors or inexperienced city dwellers. They were skilled outdoorsmen who knew the Idaho wilderness intimately and had been hunting together for over a decade. They had obtained permits to hunt elk in the Blackwood Creek area, a remote section of the Boise National Forest known for its dense timber and challenging terrain. The area was accessible only by a series of logging roads that required 4-wheel drive vehicles, and the nearest cell tower was approximately 40 miles away. The men had planned a 5-day trip, setting up a base camp near Blackwood Creek itself, and planning to hunt from there using established game trails they'd scouted in previous years. The first sign of trouble came on their second day, September 14th, when Liam noticed unusual animal behavior during their morning hunt. As a wildlife biologist, Liam was trained to observe and interpret animal behavior patterns, and what he was seeing didn't match any normal ecosystem activity. Birds were completely absent from large sections of forest, yet there were no signs of predator activity that would explain their absence. More disturbing, They found several deer carcasses that appeared to have been killed recently, but not by any predator Liam could identify. The deer showed massive trauma wounds, as if they'd been killed by something with incredible strength. But the killing seemed purposeless. The meat was left untouched, and the wounds were too large and irregular to match any known predator species in Idaho. Alexander first saw the creature late that afternoon while hunting alone about half a mile from their base camp. His initial description, given to the group when he returned badly shaken, was of something roughly human-shaped but larger than any person could be. At least 8 feet tall and covered in dark, matted hair. What disturbed Alexander most wasn't the creature's size, but its behavior. It hadn't fled when it saw him, as any normal animal would. Instead, it had studied him with what Alexander described as intelligent curiosity, tilting its head and observing his movements as if it were learning about him. When Alexander raised his rifle, the creature had melted back into the trees with a fluid, silent movement that seemed impossible for something so large. The group decided to pack up and leave immediately. But when they reached their vehicles, they discovered that all 4 trucks had been systematically disabled. Brake lines had been cut with what appeared to be claws. Tires had been shredded, and engine components had been torn out with incredible force. What made the situation even more ominous was the evidence of intelligence behind the sabotage. Whoever or whatever had disabled the vehicles had known exactly which components to target to make the trucks completely inoperable. This wasn't random destruction, it was strategic, deliberate action designed to trap them in the wilderness. That night, they set up a defensive perimeter around their camp, taking turns standing watch in pairs. Tom, with his law enforcement background, organized them into a formal security rotation and established emergency procedures. They had a satellite phone for emergencies, but the mountainous terrain made getting a clear signal difficult, requiring them to move to higher elevation for communication attempts. Around 11 p.m., Chris and Alexander were on watch when they heard the first sounds that convinced them they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a single creature. The sounds came from multiple directions simultaneously. Deep, guttural calls that seemed to be some form of communication between several entities surrounding their camp. Chris, drawing on his military experience, recognized the pattern as tactical coordination. The calls would start from one direction, receive responses from 2 or 3 other positions, then shift to a new pattern of locations. Whatever was out there was not only intelligent, but was working as an organized group, systematically encircling their position and communicating about their observations and plans. The first 911 call was made at 11:47 p.m. on September 14th. Tom managed to get a signal by climbing a nearby ridge and called his own department's emergency line. The recording, which I obtained through a public records request, captures Tom's professional composure beginning to crack as he describes their situation to dispatcher Carol Jensen. "This is Deputy Tom Bradley, badge number 4471. I'm calling from Blackwood Creek hunting area with 3 civilians. We have an emergency situation. Unknown entities have disabled our vehicles and are currently surrounding our position. I need immediate backup and emergency evacuation." What followed was nearly 3 hours of calls between Tom and various law enforcement agencies as he tried to convince someone to take their situation seriously. The initial response was skeptical. Dispatchers assumed they were dealing with either a prank call or hunters who had damaged their own vehicles and were embarrassed to admit it. It wasn't until Tom provided his badge number and department supervisors confirmed his identity that anyone began treating the calls as legitimate emergencies requiring response. The second night, September 15th, brought escalated activity from whatever was stalking them. The creatures, and by this point, all 4 men were convinced they were dealing with multiple entities, began testing their defenses more aggressively. Large rocks were thrown into their camp from the darkness beyond their firelight, landing with tremendous force that suggested incredible throwing strength. Trees around their perimeter began shaking violently, as if something massive was climbing through the branches and deliberately making noise to terrorize them. Liam made the most disturbing discovery during his watch shift, around 3 a.m. Using night vision binoculars he'd brought for wildlife observation, he spotted what appeared to be coordinated movement in the tree line. Multiple large shapes were positioning themselves at regular intervals around the camp, and their movements showed clear evidence of tactical planning. They would move into position, remain stationary for extended periods while apparently observing the camp, then relocate based on some form of silent communication. Liam counted at least 6 distinct entities, all roughly the same size and displaying the same unnaturally fluid movement patterns. The situation reached a crisis point on their 3rd night when the creatures began actively probing their defenses. Around midnight, something began systematically destroying their equipment that was outside their immediate defensive perimeter. Their hunting gear was torn apart, their food caches were scattered, and their emergency supplies were methodically destroyed with what appeared to be deliberate malice. The destruction wasn't random feeding behavior. It was psychological warfare designed to demoralize and weaken them. The most terrifying moment came when Tom was making another emergency call from the ridge. While he was describing their situation to a state police dispatcher, he suddenly went silent for nearly 30 seconds. When he resumed speaking, his voice was barely a whisper. "There's one right behind me. It's been listening to everything I've said. Oh God, it knows we've called for help." The call ended abruptly, and when Tom returned to camp 20 minutes later, he was nearly catatonic with fear. Tom later described the encounter to investigators. The creature had approached him silently while he was focused on the phone call, and had stood approximately 10 feet away, apparently listening to his conversation with authorities, when Tom finally noticed it. The creature didn't flee or attack. Instead, it had stared at him with what Tom described as human-like intelligence for nearly a full minute before turning and walking away with deliberate, measured steps. The message was clear: they were being studied, and their attempts to call for help were being monitored and evaluated. The rescue came on September 17th when a combined team of Idaho State Police, Boise County Sheriff's deputies, and Fish and Game wardens finally reached their location. The response team, led by Sergeant Mariah Rodriguez, later filed reports describing physical evidence that supported the hunters' accounts. Trees around the campsite showed claw marks at heights exceeding 10 feet, gouged so deeply into the bark that they appeared to have been made by something with incredible strength. Ground impressions suggested bipedal creatures with foot sizes significantly larger than human, and the pattern of movements indicated multiple entities working in coordination. Most compelling was the evidence of intelligence behind the encounter. The disabled vehicles showed signs of systematic sabotage that required understanding of mechanical systems. The pattern of psychological harassment suggested entities capable of long-term planning and emotional manipulation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a primatologist consulted by the Idaho Fish and Game Department, noted that the described behavior patterns indicated intelligence levels far exceeding any known North American wildlife species. All 4 hunters underwent psychological evaluation following their rescue, and their accounts remained consistent across multiple interviews with different investigators. Alexander left Idaho permanently, relocating to Phoenix, where he works in an office environment and refuses to discuss the incident. Chris has been diagnosed with PTSD related to the encounter and requires ongoing therapy. Liam transferred to a desk job with Fish and Game and no longer conducts field research. Tom returned to duty, but requested assignment to urban patrol areas and has never returned to wilderness areas. The Blackwood Creek area was temporarily closed to hunting and camping following the incident, though it has since reopened with enhanced safety protocols. However, the Idaho Fish and Game Department now requires all hunters in the area to carry satellite communication devices and to check in every 12 hours. Several subsequent hunting parties have reported unusual activity in the same general area, though none have experienced encounters as prolonged or intensive as the September 2021 incident. What makes this case particularly credible is the combination of multiple witness testimony, physical evidence, recorded emergency communications, and the professional backgrounds of the witnesses themselves. These weren't people prone to fantasy or exaggeration. They were experienced outdoorsmen, including a law enforcement officer and a wildlife biologist, who encountered something that challenged their understanding of what exists in North American wilderness areas. The systematic, intelligent behavior they described suggests entities capable of complex planning, tool use, and psychological manipulation. Characteristics that don't match any known wildlife species, but align disturbingly well with accounts of similar encounters from other remote wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest. Let's move to our fifth story. Our fifth case brings us into the digital age of horror, taking place in October of 2022 in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, where what started as a social media influencer's attempt to document a peaceful cabin retreat became a terrifying demonstration of how modern technology can be weaponized by someone with malicious intent and intimate knowledge of their victim's life. This story belongs to Evelyn Rodriguez, a lifestyle and travel influencer with over 200,000 followers across Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, who discovered that her digital footprint had made her the perfect target for someone who turned her own content creation into a psychological weapon. Evelyn had built her social media presence around authentic lifestyle content, sharing her daily routines, travel experiences, and personal reflections with an audience that appreciated her genuine, unfiltered approach to content creation. Unlike many influencers who carefully curated their online personas, Evelyn prided herself on showing the real, sometimes messy aspects of her life. She regularly went live on Instagram to chat with followers while cooking dinner, shared unedited photos from her travels, and maintained what she believed was a healthy boundary between her online presence and her private life. When Evelyn decided to book a week-long solo retreat at a remote cabin in Shenandoah National Park, she saw it as the perfect opportunity to create content around digital detox and self-care. The cabin she selected was located approximately 15 miles from the nearest town of Luray, accessible by a winding mountain road that required careful navigation even in good weather. The property was owned by a local family who had been renting it through various platforms for several years, and Evelyn had chosen it specifically because of its rustic charm and complete isolation from the distractions of urban life. She planned to document her journey toward mindfulness and reconnection with nature, while still maintaining her content schedule through pre-recorded posts and occasional live streams when the internet connection allowed. Evelyn arrived at the cabin on October 3rd and immediately began creating content about her retreat experience. Her first Instagram post showed her unpacking in the cozy living room, with natural lighting streaming through large windows that offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. She posted stories about her evening routine, shared a time-lapse of herself preparing a simple dinner, and went live on Instagram to show her followers the stunning sunset from the cabin's wraparound porch. Everything seemed perfect for the peaceful, rejuvenating experience she had planned to share with her audience. The first sign of something wrong came on her second day, when Evelyn noticed that someone had created what appeared to be mirror accounts of her social media profiles. These fake accounts had usernames almost identical to hers, with slight variations that would be difficult to notice at first glance. More disturbing, these fake accounts were posting content that exactly matched her posts from the cabin, but with subtle differences that made her feel deeply unsettled. Where her original post showed her morning coffee ritual, the fake account posted the same image but taken from outside the cabin window, showing her performing the same routine but photographed by someone watching from the forest. Initially, Evelyn assumed she was dealing with a typical case of account impersonation, something many influencers faced. She reported the fake accounts to the platforms and posted warnings to her followers about the impersonation attempts. However, as she continued documenting her retreat, the fake accounts continued to post parallel content that became increasingly impossible to explain through normal means. When Evelyn posted a photo of herself reading by the fireplace, the fake account posted a nearly identical image that appeared to be taken from outside the cabin, showing her through the window in exactly the same pose, wearing the same clothes, at exactly the same time. The situation escalated dramatically on October 5th when Evelyn decided to do a live stream to address the fake accounts directly. She set up her camera on the kitchen counter and began streaming to her followers, explaining the impersonation situation and asking for their help in reporting the fake profiles. Approximately 10 minutes into the live stream, viewers in the chat began alerting her to something disturbing happening on the fake accounts. In real time, as Evelyn was streaming live from inside the cabin, the fake accounts were posting stories and going live themselves, showing her exact same live stream but filmed from outside the cabin through the kitchen window. Evelyn's terror was captured live as she realized that someone was outside the cabin, watching her through the windows and broadcasting their own version of her content in real time. The parallel live streams showed her from multiple angles, through the kitchen window, through the living room windows, and from positions that suggested the person outside was moving around the cabin's perimeter while she was streaming. Her followers, watching both streams simultaneously, began flooding her chat with warnings and frantically telling her to call the police. What made the situation even more psychologically devastating was the sophistication of the stalking operation. The fake accounts had been created months earlier and had been gradually building followers by reposting Evelyn's content with slight modifications. The person behind the accounts had studied her posting patterns, her daily routines, her travel schedules, and her personal preferences with obsessive detail. They had somehow known about her cabin retreat plans before she had even publicly announced them, and had been positioned at the location waiting for her arrival. The fake accounts also revealed an intimate knowledge of Evelyn's personal life that went far beyond what she shared publicly. Posts included references to her childhood pets, inside jokes with friends that she'd never mentioned online, and personal details about her family that she had never shared with her audience. The stalker had clearly been researching her extensively, possibly for months, gathering information from multiple sources to create a comprehensive profile of her life, habits, and vulnerabilities. Evelyn immediately ended her live stream and called 911, but the response time to the remote location was over an hour. During that time, she barricaded herself in the cabin's bedroom and monitored the fake accounts through her phone. The accounts continued posting throughout the night, sharing content that appeared to be taken from outside the cabin as the stalker maintained surveillance of the property. Some posts included audio recordings of Evelyn's phone conversations with the police, indicating that the person outside had sophisticated listening equipment and was monitoring all of her communications. The most disturbing posts came after midnight, when the fake accounts began sharing content that predicted Evelyn's actions before she made them. A post would appear saying, "She's going to check the front door now." And seconds later, Evelyn would feel compelled to check the door locks. Another post stated, "She's going to look out the bedroom window in 3 minutes." And despite her efforts to avoid doing exactly that, she found herself drawn to peek through the curtains at the predicted time. The stalkers seemed to understand her psychological responses well enough to predict her behavior with unnerving accuracy. When Virginia State Police finally arrived, led by Trooper Michael Chen, they found evidence of an elaborate surveillance operation that had been in place for several days before Evelyn's arrival. The area around the cabin was littered with high-tech surveillance equipment, including trail cameras, wireless microphones, and signal boosters that had been used to monitor the cabin and maintain internet connectivity for the real-time posting operation. The sophistication of the setup suggested someone with significant technical expertise and financial resources. The investigation revealed that the stalker had been tracking Evelyn's location through multiple methods, including analyzing metadata from her photos, monitoring her credit card transactions, and possibly accessing her travel booking information through data breaches. The person had created detailed dossiers, not just on Evelyn, but on her family members, friends, and regular associates, suggesting a level of obsession and planning that went far beyond typical social media stalking. Digital forensics expert Dr. Sarah Williams, who was brought in to analyze the fake accounts and their posting patterns, discovered that the operation had been running for over 8 months. The stalker had been creating parallel content for nearly everything Evelyn posted, building what Dr. Williams described as a shadow digital identity that mirrored Evelyn's online presence with disturbing precision. The technical skill required to maintain real-time parallel posting, coordinate multiple fake accounts, and manage the surveillance equipment simultaneously indicated someone with professional-level expertise in digital systems and social media manipulation. The psychological impact on Evelyn was severe and lasting. She discovered that her sense of privacy had been completely violated for months without her knowledge. Every personal moment she thought she was sharing authentically with her audience had been watched, recorded, and replicated by someone who had turned her own content creation process into a form of psychological torture. The stalker had weaponized her genuine desire to connect with her audience, using her openness and authenticity against her in the most invasive way possible. Despite extensive investigation by both state and federal authorities, the person responsible for the stalking operation was never identified. The fake accounts were shut down, but new ones appeared periodically with similar content and posting patterns, suggesting that the stalker continued monitoring Evelyn's activities. The technical sophistication of the operation and the resources required to maintain it suggested either an individual with significant technical expertise and financial means, or possibly a coordinated group effort. Evelyn took a 6-month hiatus from social media following the incident and has since dramatically changed her approach to content creation. She no longer shares real-time location information, avoids posting about travel plans until after she's returned home, and has hired a digital security consultant to monitor for fake accounts and unauthorized use of her content. She's also become an advocate for influencer safety and digital privacy rights, working with law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for investigating tech-enabled stalking cases. The case highlighted the unique vulnerabilities faced by content creators in the digital age, where the very openness that makes someone successful on social media can also make them perfect targets for sophisticated stalkers. It also demonstrated how modern technology can be used to turn a victim's own content creation into a weapon against them, blurring the lines between public and private life in ways that previous generations of stalkers could never have achieved. What makes Evelyn's case particularly disturbing is how it represents the evolution of stalking behavior in the digital age. Her stalker didn't just watch her. They created an elaborate parallel digital identity that allowed them to maintain constant, intimate surveillance, while also psychologically tormenting her through her own social media platforms. The case serves as a chilling reminder that in our interconnected world, the tools we use to share our lives can also be used by those who wish to control and terrorize us. Let's move to our 6th story. Our 6th case takes us into the realm of generational horror. where the sins of the past refuse to stay buried, connecting two families separated by 45 years through experiences so identical that investigators initially suspected one was copying the other. This story spans from July 1973 to July 2018, linking the Whitmore family's nightmare to the Morrison family's ordeal at the same inherited cabin in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. What makes this case extraordinary is not just the supernatural phenomena both families reported, but the documented evidence suggesting that whatever haunts this property specifically targets bloodlines, waiting patiently for each new generation to claim their inheritance. The story begins with the Whitmore family in 1973. Robert Whitmore, a 34-year-old insurance adjuster from Albany, inherited a small cabin on Lake Champlain from his great-uncle Theodore, a reclusive man who had lived alone in the mountains for most of his adult life. Robert had barely known Theodore, having met him only a few times during childhood family gatherings. But the inheritance included not just the cabin, but also 40 acres of pristine lakefront property that represented significant value. Robert decided to take his wife Margaret and their two children, 8-year-old Susan and 5-year-old Michael, for a summer vacation to the property, both to introduce the family to their inheritance and to decide whether to keep the cabin or sell it. The cabin was rustic but well-maintained, a 2-bedroom log structure built in the 1920s with a stone foundation and a wraparound porch that offered stunning views of the lake. The property felt isolated but peaceful, surrounded by dense forest and accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through the mountains for several miles before reaching the nearest paved highway. Robert initially felt a sense of pride in owning such a beautiful piece of family history, and the first few days of their July vacation were exactly what the family had hoped for. Fishing, swimming, hiking, and enjoying the kind of simple pleasures that felt increasingly rare in their suburban Albany life. The first supernatural incident occurred on their 4th night, July 18th, when Susan woke the family by screaming that there were people in her room. Robert and Margaret rushed to the children's bedroom to find Susan pointing at an antique family photograph that hung on the wall. A formal portrait of what appeared to be a family from the early 1900s. Susan insisted that the people in the photograph had been moving, talking to each other, and staring at her while she tried to sleep. The photograph showed a stern-looking man, a woman in Victorian dress, and 3 children, all posed formally in front of what appeared to be the same cabin where the Whitmores were staying. Margaret initially dismissed Susan's claims as a nightmare, but when she examined the East-West photograph more closely, she noticed something that made her deeply uncomfortable. The family in the photograph bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Whitmores themselves. The man looked remarkably like Robert. The woman shared Margaret's facial structure and hair color, and the 3 children could have been siblings to Susan and Michael. The resemblance was so strong that it felt like looking at their own family portrait, but dressed in clothing from 70 years earlier. The incidents escalated over the following nights. Robert began experiencing vivid dreams where he was living in the cabin during a different time period, surrounded by people he didn't recognize, but who called him by name and treated him as if he belonged to their family. In these dreams, he was always the head of a household that included a wife and children who bore strong resemblances to Margaret, Susan, and Michael, but who lived in conditions that suggested the early 20th century. The dreams were so detailed and persistent that Robert began feeling more rested in the dream world than in his waking life. Margaret started finding objects around the cabin that hadn't been there when they arrived. Children's toys from the 1920s, women's clothing that fit her perfectly despite being decades out of style, and personal items like jewelry and books that seemed to belong to her even though she'd never seen them before. Most disturbing, She began experiencing episodes where she would catch her reflection in the cabin's antique mirrors and see herself dressed in period clothing, appearing to be living in the same cabin but during a different era. The children's experiences were perhaps the most unsettling. Susan and Michael began playing with invisible friends they claimed were other children who lived in the cabin. They would have elaborate conversations with these unseen playmates, and their behavior began changing to match what appeared to be the social norms and speech patterns of children from the early 1900s. Susan started speaking in more formal language and expressing knowledge about historical events and daily life practices that she couldn't have learned anywhere else. Michael began demonstrating skills like whittling and basic carpentry that no 5-year-old should have possessed. The family's vacation was cut short on July 23rd, when Robert found a family Bible in the cabin's attic that contained genealogical records dating back to the 1800s. The Bible documented multiple generations of the same family living in the cabin, and the family tree showed that Robert was indeed descended from the original owners. More chilling, the records indicated that every generation of the family had experienced what were described as spiritual visitations and ancestral guidance during their stays at the property. Several entries suggested that family members had been called home to the cabin during times of personal crisis or major life decisions. The Whitmores left the cabin immediately after finding the Bible and never returned. Robert sold the property within 6 months, and the family never discussed their experiences there publicly. However, Robert kept detailed notes about their stay, documenting the supernatural incidents and his research into the family history. These notes would prove crucial 45 years later when the property's new owners experienced nearly identical phenomena. In 2018, the cabin was purchased by David Morrison, a software engineer from New York City who had recently inherited a substantial sum from his grandmother's estate. David had been looking for a weekend retreat where he could work on personal programming projects while enjoying the peace of mountain life. The cabin had been through several owners since 1973, but none had reported supernatural activity, leading David to believe he was getting an excellent deal on a property that previous owners simply hadn't appreciated. David brought his wife Jennifer and their twins, 7-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Luke, to the cabin for what was intended to be a month-long summer retreat in July 2018. Like the Whitmores 45 years earlier, the Morrison family initially loved the property and felt a strong sense of connection to the cabin that seemed to exceed what they should have felt for a place they'd never visited before. The supernatural phenomena began on their 4th night, following exactly the same pattern as the Whitmore family's experiences. Emma woke the family by claiming that the people in the antique photograph were moving and talking. When Jennifer examined the photograph, she discovered that it now showed a different family, one that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Morrisons themselves. The photograph appeared to be from the 1970s based on the clothing and style, and Jennifer realized with growing horror that she was looking at what appeared to be her own family, but photographed decades before any of them had been born. The dreams, the mysterious objects, the children's invisible friends, every element of the Whitmore family's experience repeated itself with the Morrisons, but with details that reflected their contemporary life rather than the 1970s setting. David found himself dreaming of life in the cabin during the 1970s, surrounded by a family that resembled the Whitmores. Jennifer discovered clothing and personal items from that era that fit her perfectly. The twins began playing with invisible friends they described as children from the old days, who taught them songs and games that had been popular in the 1970s. The revelation came when David found Robert Whitmore's hidden notes in the cabin's basement, tucked behind a loose stone in the foundation wall. Robert had apparently hidden his documentation before selling the property, perhaps hoping that future families might benefit from understanding what they were facing. The notes detailed every aspect of the Whitmore family's supernatural experiences and included research into the cabin's history that revealed a pattern stretching back over a century. According to Robert's research, the cabin existed at the center of what he termed a generational vortex, a phenomenon where the spiritual energy of past families continued to inhabit the property and attempted to draw new families into their eternal existence there. Each family that stayed at the cabin long enough would begin to merge with the spiritual echoes of previous families, eventually becoming part of the phenomenon themselves and contributing to the experiences of future occupants. The research suggested that the supernatural activity intensified around the fourth night of each family's stay, and that families who remained longer than a week risked becoming permanently trapped in the cycle. Robert's notes included testimonies from local historians who confirmed that several families over the decades had simply disappeared from the cabin, leaving behind all their possessions but vanishing without any trace or explanation of where they had gone. David Morrison contacted paranormal investigator Dr. Patricia Wells, who specializes in generational hauntings and inherited supernatural phenomena. Dr. Wells confirmed that the Morrison family's experiences matched documented cases of what she termed bloodline hauntings, supernatural phenomena that specifically target family lines and attempt to maintain continuity across generations through supernatural means. She noted that such cases were rare but typically involved properties where multiple generations of the same family had died or experienced significant trauma. The Morrison family left the cabin on their sixth night, following the same timeline as the Whitmores had 45 years earlier. Like the Whitmores, they sold the property immediately, but not before ensuring that Robert Whitmore's research notes were preserved and made available to future owners. David also created a detailed digital archive of their experiences, including audio recordings, photographs, and video evidence of the supernatural phenomena they had witnessed. The property remains privately owned but has not been occupied for extended periods since 2018. Local real estate agents report that multiple families have attempted to purchase the cabin for vacation use, but none have completed stays longer than 3 days. The pattern continues, suggesting that whatever spiritual force inhabits the property remains active and continues to seek new families to join its eternal cycle of generational haunting. What makes this case unique is the documented evidence of supernatural phenomena that spans multiple decades and specifically targets families based on their willingness to embrace the property as a generational inheritance. The experiences of both the Whitmore and Morrison families suggest that some locations may serve as spiritual traps designed to capture and preserve family units across time, creating an eternal cycle where past, present, and future families exist simultaneously in the same supernatural space. Let's move to our seventh story. Our seventh case brings us into the realm of acoustic horror, where sound itself becomes a window into something that shouldn't exist. This story takes place in Olympic National Forest, Washington, in May of 2020. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when professional sound engineer Marcus Webb decided to use his forced isolation to pursue a passion project, recording the pure, untouched sounds of nature in one of America's most pristine wilderness areas. What Marcus captured instead was audio evidence of phenomena that challenged everything he understood about sound, time, and the nature of reality itself. Marcus had been working in the film industry for over 15 years, specializing in location sound recording for major motion pictures. When the pandemic shut down film production in early 2020, Marcus found himself with an unexpected opportunity to pursue personal projects that had been on hold for years. He had always been fascinated by the acoustic properties of untouched wilderness areas and wanted to create a library of pristine nature sounds that could be used for meditation, therapy, and artistic purposes. Olympic National Forest, with its ancient old-growth forests and minimal human interference, seemed like the perfect location for this ambitious project. Marcus rented a remote cabin through the Forest Service that was located approximately 25 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail, and positioned in a valley that provided natural acoustic isolation from any human-generated sounds. The cabin was basic but functional, equipped with solar panels for electricity and designed to have minimal impact on the surrounding environment. Marcus brought professional-grade recording equipment, including multiple high-sensitivity microphones, digital recorders capable of capturing frequencies beyond human hearing range, and specialized windscreens and shock mounts designed for outdoor recording in challenging conditions. His plan was to spend 2 weeks at the cabin, recording during different times of day and night to capture the full spectrum of natural sounds in the area. Marcus was particularly interested in what acousticians call the sound floor, the baseline level of ambient sound that exists in truly quiet environments. In most locations, this sound floor is dominated by human-generated noise, even when no obvious sources are present. But Marcus hoped that the Olympic Peninsula's isolation might allow him to capture something closer to the pure acoustic environment that existed before human civilization. The first week of recording went exactly as Marcus had hoped. His equipment captured an incredible range of natural sounds, the subtle creaking of ancient trees, the complex layering of bird calls at different times of day, the acoustic properties of wind moving through various types of vegetation, and the delicate sounds of small animals moving through the forest floor. Marcus was particularly pleased with his nighttime recordings, which captured what he believed was some of the quietest ambient sound ever recorded in North America, with sound levels dropping to near the theoretical limits of his equipment's sensitivity. It was during his second week that Marcus began noticing anomalies in his recordings that initially seemed like equipment malfunctions, but eventually revealed something far more disturbing. On May 14th, while reviewing audio he had recorded the previous night, Marcus discovered what appeared to be human voices buried deep in the background of what should have been pure wilderness ambiance. The voices were barely audible, requiring significant digital enhancement to isolate, and they seemed to be speaking English, but with unusual cadence and pronunciation that Marcus couldn't immediately identify. Marcus initially assumed he was hearing radio transmissions that his sensitive equipment was somehow picking up, despite the remote location and the fact that his recording setup was specifically designed to reject electromagnetic interference. However, when he analyzed the audio more carefully using professional spectrum analysis software, he discovered that the voices weren't coming through electromagnetic transmission. They were acoustic sounds, captured by his microphones as actual sound waves traveling through the air. Yet there was no identifiable source for the voices anywhere in the area. The content of the voices became more disturbing as Marcus continued his analysis. Using audio enhancement techniques he had learned in film work, Marcus was able to isolate and clarify the speech enough to transcribe portions of what was being said. The voices appeared to be having conversations about events that hadn't happened yet, with specific details about Marcus's own activities and plans that were accurate but shouldn't have been known to anyone else. One voice, which sounded like an older man, said clearly, "He's going to find the old trail marker tomorrow morning, the one that fell down in the storm 3 weeks ago." Marcus checked his planned recording schedule and realized he had indeed intended to explore a trail the next morning that he hadn't mentioned to anyone and hadn't written down anywhere. More unsettling. When Marcus hiked the trail the following day, he found an old wooden trail marker that had clearly fallen recently and was partially hidden by storm debris. Another voice, this one sounding like a younger woman, was heard saying, "The rain on Tuesday will force him to move the equipment inside, and that's when he'll discover the problem with the south-facing microphone." Marcus had been monitoring weather forecasts and knew that rain was predicted for Tuesday. But he had no idea there was any problem with his equipment. When the predicted rain arrived and Marcus moved his recording setup inside the cabin, he discovered that his south-facing microphone had developed an intermittent connection problem that was causing audio dropouts he hadn't previously noticed. As Marcus continued analyzing his recordings, he found more examples of voices discussing future events with impossible accuracy. The conversations seemed to be taking place in reverse chronological order. Voices would discuss events that would happen to Marcus in the coming days, then mention things that had happened in recent days, then reference events from his past. It was as if Marcus was hearing one side of conversations that were occurring outside the normal flow of time, with participants who had access to information about his entire timeline simultaneously. The most disturbing discovery came when Marcus began analyzing recordings made before he had heard any of the anomalous voices. When he enhanced audio from his first day at the cabin, he found voices discussing his arrival and predicting his reaction to finding the voices in his later recordings. One voice said, "When he finds us on Thursday, he'll think it's equipment malfunction first, then radio interference. He won't accept what he's actually hearing until he finds the conversation about the trail marker." Marcus realized he was listening to voices that had predicted his exact response to discovering them, recorded days before he had actually experienced that response. Marcus contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, an acoustic physicist at the University of Washington who specialized in anomalous sound phenomena. Dr. Chen was initially skeptical, but agreed to analyze Marcus's recordings after he sent her unenhanced samples. Her analysis confirmed that the voices were indeed acoustic phenomena rather than electromagnetic interference or equipment malfunction. More puzzling, spectral analysis revealed that the voices exhibited frequency characteristics that suggested they were being produced by normal human vocal cords. Yet there was no Doppler shift or distance attenuation that would be expected if the voices were coming from any specific location in the forest. Dr. Chen's report noted that the voices appeared to exist in what she termed acoustic isolation. They were present in the recordings, but showed none of the acoustic properties that would be expected if they were being produced by people actually present in the environment. The voices had no echo or reverberation despite the fact that the forest location should have produced significant acoustic reflections. They showed no frequency filtering that would result from traveling through air over distance. Most importantly, the voices maintained consistent volume and clarity regardless of which microphone had recorded them, even though Marcus's microphones were positioned hundreds of yards apart with different acoustic properties. The investigation took an even stranger turn when Dr. Chen discovered that similar anomalous voice recordings had been reported by researchers in the same general area of Olympic National Forest, dating back to the 1970s. Archives from the University of Washington's Acoustic Research Program contained reports from multiple scientific expeditions that had recorded unexplained human voices in various locations throughout the peninsula. In each case, the voices had demonstrated knowledge of future events and had spoken about the researchers' activities with impossible accuracy. Most disturbing was a 1987 recording made by a graduate student named David Park, who had been conducting thesis research on old-growth forest acoustics. Park's recordings contained voices discussing Marcus Webb by name and describing his 2020 recording project with specific details. Recorded 33 years before Marcus had even conceived of the project. The voices had predicted Marcus's arrival at the cabin, his equipment setup, and even the specific anomalies he would discover in his recordings. Marcus completed his 2-week stay despite the unsettling discoveries. But his final recordings contained increasingly disturbing content. The voices began discussing other people who would come to the area in future years, describing recording projects and research expeditions that hadn't been planned yet. They mentioned specific individuals by name, including researchers who hadn't yet been born and technology that didn't yet exist. The voices seemed to exist in a temporal space where past, present, and future were equally accessible, and where they could observe and comment on events across decades of time. When Marcus returned to Seattle, he found that his experience had been changed by exposure to whatever acoustic phenomenon existed in that valley. He began experiencing auditory hallucinations, where he would hear the same voices commenting on his daily activities and predicting his future decisions. The voices would accurately predict phone calls minutes before they arrived, describe the contents of mail before he opened it, and discuss his plans before he had consciously made them. Marcus underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluation, but doctors found no evidence of any condition that would explain his experiences. Audiological testing showed that his hearing was normal, and psychological assessment indicated no signs of mental illness or substance abuse. However, when doctors analyzed audio recordings Marcus made of his daily life, they found the same anomalous voices present in the background, confirming that the phenomenon had somehow followed him home from the forest. Dr. Chen's final report concluded that Marcus had encountered what she termed temporal acoustic anomalies, sound phenomena that appeared to exist outside normal causality and demonstrated knowledge of events across extended time periods. She theorized that certain locations might serve as acoustic windows into different temporal states, allowing sounds from past and future events to leak into the present moment. However, she acknowledged that this explanation raised more questions than it answered about the nature of time, causality, and the relationship between consciousness and acoustic phenomena. Marcus stopped working as a sound engineer following his experience, and now works in software development, avoiding any profession that requires careful listening. He maintains that the voices continue to provide commentary on his life, though they have become less frequent and less intrusive over time. He's donated his Olympic Peninsula recordings to the University of Washington's Acoustic Research Archive, where they continue to be studied by researchers trying to understand phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of sound and time. The Olympic Peninsula location, where Marcus recorded, continues to attract researchers interested in anomalous acoustic phenomena, though the Forest Service now requires special permits for recording activities in that area. Several subsequent expeditions have reported similar experiences, confirming that whatever Marcus encountered remains active and continues to demonstrate impossible knowledge about future events and the personal lives of visitors to that remote valley in the Washington wilderness. Let's move to our eighth story. Our eighth case takes us to the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee in December of 2019, where what initially appeared to be a classic supernatural haunting revealed itself to be something far more sinister and scientifically explainable, yet somehow more terrifying than any ghost story. This is the account of the Patterson family's Christmas vacation that became a medical emergency, documented through security camera footage that captured not just their gradual poisoning, but their increasingly disturbing responses to hallucinations that may not have been entirely caused by carbon monoxide after all. The Patterson family, David, 39, a marketing executive from Nashville, his wife Rebecca, 36, a pediatric nurse, and their children, Sophie, 12, and Nathan, 9, had booked a week-long Christmas vacation at a luxury cabin rental in Gatlinburg. The property, marketed as Winter Haven Lodge, was a beautifully appointed 3-bedroom cabin with all modern amenities, situated on a private hillside with panoramic views of the Smoky Mountains. The rental company, Mountain Vista Properties, had an excellent reputation and maintained detailed safety inspections for all their properties, making the cabin seem like a perfect choice for a family seeking a traditional mountain Christmas experience. The cabin had been recently renovated with a new heating system, updated kitchen appliances, and a state-of-the-art security system that the owners had installed to monitor the property remotely and ensure guest safety. The security cameras were positioned throughout the common areas of the cabin and on the exterior, providing comprehensive coverage that would later prove crucial to understanding what happened during the Patterson family's stay. The family arrived on December 22nd, planning to stay until December 29th, with arrangements for extended family to join them for Christmas dinner. The first 3 days of their vacation were exactly what the Patterson family had hoped for. Security footage shows them decorating the cabin's Christmas tree, cooking elaborate meals together, playing board games by the fireplace, and enjoying the kind of quality family time that their busy Nashville lives rarely allowed. David and Rebecca appeared relaxed and happy, while Sophie and Nathan seemed to be having the perfect holiday experience. The cabin's heating system was working efficiently, maintaining a comfortable temperature despite the unusually cold weather that had brought snow to the higher elevations. The first signs of trouble appeared on Christmas Day, December 25th, though they were subtle enough that the family initially attributed them to holiday excitement and disrupted sleep schedules. Security footage from that morning shows the family opening presents and preparing Christmas breakfast. But their movements appear slightly sluggish and uncoordinated compared to previous days. Rebecca later told investigators that she had felt mildly nauseous that morning and attributed it to eating too much rich food during their vacation, while David mentioned experiencing a persistent headache that he blamed on holiday stress. By the evening of December 25th, the security footage reveals more obvious signs that something was wrong with the family's behavior. During what appears to be a normal family dinner, the cameras capture moments where individual family members seem to be reacting to things that aren't visible in the footage. Sophie is seen having animated conversations with empty air, gesturing and responding as if someone is talking back to her. Nathan appears to be watching something move around the room, his head tracking motion that the cameras don't record. David and Rebecca both exhibit episodes where they stop mid-conversation and stare at specific locations in the cabin with expressions of fear or confusion. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next 2 days. Security footage from December 26th shows the family's behavior becoming increasingly erratic and disconnected from reality. Rebecca is seen barricading doors with furniture, apparently trying to keep something out, though the exterior cameras show no activity around the cabin. David spends hours talking to what appears to be another person in the living room, carrying on detailed conversations with someone the cameras don't capture. The children's behavior becomes more concerning, with both Sophie and Nathan exhibiting signs of terror, hiding under furniture and crying about things that aren't visible in the recordings. What makes the security footage particularly disturbing is how it captures the family responding to a shared hallucination that appears to be consistent across all 4 family members. At several points, all 4 Pattersons are seen reacting to the same apparent stimulus, looking in the same direction, responding with similar fear or confusion, and moving in coordinated ways that suggest they're all seeing and hearing the same things. Yet the cameras record nothing that could explain their reactions, creating footage that shows a family terrorized by invisible phenomena. On December 27th, the situation reached a crisis point that was captured in real time by the security system. Footage from that evening shows Rebecca attempting to call for help on her cell phone, but she appears to be having difficulty concentrating and repeatedly forgets what she's doing mid-call. David is seen trying to gather the family's belongings as if preparing to leave, but he becomes distracted and confused, eventually abandoning the packing effort entirely. The children are visibly ill, appearing lethargic and disoriented, but they continue to react with fear to things the cameras don't record. The most chilling footage comes from the early morning hours of December 28th, when the cameras capture what appears to be the family responding to a coordinated attack by invisible assailants. All 4 family members are seen taking defensive positions, moving through the cabin as if evading pursuers, and exhibiting signs of genuine terror. They appear to be following a specific escape route, helping each other navigate obstacles that don't exist, and communicating about threats that the cameras can't detect. The footage shows a family in complete panic, responding to a shared hallucination with such consistency that it appears they're experiencing an actual physical threat. The rescue came when Rebecca's sister, concerned about not hearing from the family for several days, contacted local authorities to request a welfare check. Sevier County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the cabin on the afternoon of December 28th and found the Patterson family in severe medical distress. All 4 family members were unconscious or semi-conscious, suffering from what paramedics quickly identified as carbon monoxide poisoning. They were immediately transported to the University of Tennessee Medical Center, where blood tests confirmed dangerous levels of carbon monoxide in their systems. The medical team, led by Dr. Michael Torres, noted that the family's symptoms were consistent with prolonged exposure to moderate levels of carbon monoxide, high enough to cause hallucinations, confusion, and cognitive impairment, but not immediately life-threatening. The Patterson family had been slowly poisoning themselves over the course of their vacation, with symptoms that gradually worsened as the carbon monoxide accumulated in their bloodstreams. Dr. Torres explained that carbon monoxide poisoning often causes vivid hallucinations, especially in cases involving prolonged exposure, and that it was common for multiple victims in the same environment to experience similar hallucinatory episodes. The investigation revealed that the cabin's newly installed heating system had a faulty heat exchanger that was leaking carbon monoxide into the cabin's air supply. The leak was subtle enough that it hadn't been detected during routine safety inspections, but it was producing enough carbon monoxide to gradually poison anyone staying in the cabin for extended periods. The cabin's excellent insulation and energy efficiency, features that had been selling points for winter rentals, had actually made the situation worse by preventing the contaminated air from escaping and allowing the carbon monoxide to build up to dangerous levels. However, what made the Patterson case unique was the security footage analysis conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a neuropsychologist specializing in toxicology-induced hallucinations. Dr. Mitchell's review of the footage revealed patterns of behavior that were difficult to explain through carbon monoxide poisoning alone. While carbon monoxide does cause hallucinations, it typically produces individual experiences that vary significantly between victims. The Patterson family's hallucinations showed an unusual level of coordination and consistency that suggested either an extremely rare form of shared toxicological response or the presence of additional factors that the medical investigation hadn't identified. Most puzzling was the timeline of the family's symptoms. Carbon monoxide poisoning typically follows predictable patterns of onset and progression, but the Patterson family's behavior showed episodes of clarity interspersed with periods of severe hallucination in ways that didn't match expected toxicological progression. Dr. Mitchell noted that there were periods captured on security footage where the family appeared to be functioning normally, followed by sudden onset of coordinated hallucinatory episodes that affected all family members simultaneously. The investigation also revealed that the Patterson family weren't the first guests to experience problems at the cabin. Mountain Vista Properties' internal records, obtained through legal proceedings following the incident, showed that 3 previous rental groups had reported supernatural activity at the property over the past 6 months. All of these reports described experiences similar to what the Patterson family had endured. Invisible presences, voices, and the feeling of being watched or threatened by unseen entities. However, these previous incidents had been brief, involving guests who had stayed only 1 or 2 nights before leaving due to their discomfort. Dr. Mitchell's final report suggested that the Patterson case represented a unique intersection of toxicological and psychological factors. The carbon monoxide poisoning had created the neurological conditions necessary for hallucinations. But the specific content and coordination of those hallucinations might have been influenced by psychological factors, including isolation, family dynamics, and the cabin environment itself. She theorized that the family's shared expectation of a peaceful holiday experience had been gradually replaced by shared anxiety about their deteriorating physical condition, creating a psychological feedback loop that amplified and coordinated their hallucinatory experiences. The Patterson family recovered fully from their carbon monoxide poisoning, though they retained vivid memories of their hallucinatory experiences during the final days of their vacation. David and Rebecca both described feeling that they had been defending their family from real threats. And both children continued to have nightmares about invisible attackers for months after the incident. The family settled out of court with Mountain Vista Properties, which implemented enhanced safety protocols and more frequent carbon monoxide testing for all their rental properties. The Winter Haven Lodge cabin was removed from the rental market and eventually sold to private owners who renovated the heating system completely. However, the security system footage from the Patterson family's stay continues to be studied by researchers interested in the intersection of toxicology and psychology. The case has become a textbook example of how environmental hazards can create experiences that feel supernatural while having entirely scientific explanations. What makes the Patterson case particularly important is how it demonstrates that even when supernatural experiences have rational explanations, they can still be genuinely terrifying and traumatic for those who experience them. The family's ordeal was real and frightening, regardless of the underlying cause, and their coordinated response to shared hallucinations created a form of horror that was both scientifically explainable and genuinely disturbing. The case serves as a reminder that sometimes the most frightening experiences are those that exist at the intersection of the explainable and the mysterious, where scientific understanding makes the phenomena more comprehensible, but not necessarily less terrifying. Let's move to our 9th story. Our 9th case takes us to the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas in April of 2024, where a routine family tornado shelter experience became the discovery of a horrific human trafficking operation that had been operating beneath the surface of rural America for years. This story belongs to the Henderson family. Michael, 42, a civil engineer from Little Rock. His wife Sarah, 39, a high school teacher. And their teenage children, Ashley, 16, and Connor, 14, who thought they were seeking safety from a severe weather outbreak, but instead stumbled into a nightmare that revealed how predators can hide their operations in plain sight, using natural disasters and community trust as cover for unthinkable crimes. The Henderson family had driven to the Ozark Mountains for a long weekend camping trip at Devil's Den State Park, planning to enjoy hiking, fishing, and quality family time away from the distractions of urban life. They had reserved a campsite for 3 nights and were looking forward to disconnecting from technology and reconnecting with each other. The weather forecast had shown a possibility of severe thunderstorms, but April storms were common in Arkansas, and the family felt confident in their ability to handle typical spring weather patterns. On April 21st, the National Weather Service issued a tornado watch for the region, followed by increasingly urgent warnings as a supercell thunderstorm developed rapidly and began producing rotation that meteorologists identified as likely to spawn tornadoes. The storm was moving directly toward the Devil's Den area, and park rangers began evacuating campers to designated safe areas. However, the storm's rapid intensification caught many visitors off guard. and the Henderson family found themselves caught between their campsite and the park's main shelter facility when tornado sirens began sounding. Michael, drawing on his engineering knowledge of severe weather safety, made the decision to seek immediate shelter rather than attempt to drive through the storm to reach the park's main facility. He spotted what appeared to be a residential property about half a mile from their campsite, with a well-maintained house and outbuildings that suggested long-term occupancy. As the storm intensified and weather radio reports confirmed tornado touchdowns in the immediate area, Michael drove his family to the property and began frantically knocking on the door, seeking permission to use the residents' storm shelter. The property was owned by Earl and Martha Benson, a couple in their 70s who had lived in the Ozark Mountains for most of their adult lives. Earl answered the door and immediately invited the Henderson family to take shelter, explaining that he had a substantial underground storm shelter behind his house that was designed to protect against even the strongest tornadoes. The Bensons seemed like typical rural Arkansas residents, friendly, hospitable, and genuinely concerned about helping strangers during a dangerous weather emergency. Earl led the family quickly across the yard as hail began falling, and tornado sirens continued their urgent warning. The storm shelter appeared to be a standard residential tornado shelter from the outside, a reinforced concrete structure built into a hillside with a heavy steel door and proper ventilation systems. Earl opened the door and ushered the Henderson family inside, explaining that the shelter was equipped with emergency supplies, communication equipment, and comfortable seating for extended stays if necessary. The interior was much larger than the family had expected, extending back into the hillside much further than typical residential shelters, with multiple rooms and what appeared to be permanent living accommodations. As the family settled into the shelter and listened to the storm raging overhead, Sarah began noticing details that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The shelter was equipped far beyond what would be necessary for tornado protection, with multiple locked doors leading to other sections, surveillance cameras mounted in the corners, and soundproofing materials on the walls that seemed designed to prevent noise from escaping rather than protecting against storm sounds. Most disturbing, she began hearing what sounded like voices coming from the locked sections of the shelter, voices that sounded young and frightened. Michael initially dismissed Sarah's concerns, attributing the sounds to storm noise and the stress of the situation. However, as they spent more time in the shelter, other family members began noticing the same anomalies. Ashley heard what sounded like someone crying in the next room, while Connor reported hearing multiple voices speaking quietly in a section of the shelter that the Bensons had said was used for storage. The voices seemed to be responding to the arrival of the Henderson family, with increased activity and what sounded like attempts to communicate through the walls. The situation became clearly dangerous when Ashley discovered that one of the locked doors wasn't completely secure. While exploring the shelter during a lull in the storm, she found that she could partially open a door that led to a corridor extending deeper into the underground complex. What she saw through the crack in the door made her immediately return to her family in terror. The corridor was lined with what appeared to be prison cells or holding areas, and she could see people inside. Young people who appeared to be held against their will. Michael confronted Earl Benson about what Ashley had seen, demanding to know what was behind the locked doors. Earl's demeanor immediately changed from friendly hospitality to cold menace. He revealed that the storm shelter was actually the entrance to an extensive underground facility that had been used for human trafficking operations for over a decade. The Benson property served as a way station in a network that moved victims between different locations across the rural South, using the isolation of the Ozark Mountains and the cover of community respectability to hide their operations. Earl explained, with chilling matter-of-factness, that the Henderson family had arrived at an extremely inconvenient time. The facility currently housed 14 victims ranging in age from 16 to 25, who were being held before transport to other locations in the trafficking network. The Bensons had been operating this facility for years, using their reputation as helpful community members to deflect any suspicion about their activities. Their remote location, underground facility, and careful cultivation of neighborly relationships had allowed them to operate undetected despite the scope of their crimes. The storm shelter had been specifically designed to serve dual purposes: legitimate tornado protection that provided cover for the underground complex, and a means of controlling access to the facility during law enforcement activity or unexpected visitors. The Bensons had apparently used severe weather events as opportunities to move victims and conduct operations, knowing that law enforcement and emergency services would be focused on storm response rather than routine patrols. Michael realized that his family was now in extreme danger. The Bensons couldn't allow them to leave with knowledge of the trafficking operation, and Earl began discussing plans for keeping the Henderson family permanently as part of the facility's inventory. Martha Benson revealed that they had contingency plans for dealing with unexpected discoveries, including ways to dispose of witnesses and modify their operations to continue functioning after security breaches. The Henderson family's escape was made possible by the same severe weather that had led them to the property initially. The tornado that had been threatening the area finally touched down near the Benson property, causing significant damage to the above-ground structures and disrupting the facility's security systems. During the chaos of the tornado impact, Michael was able to overpower Earl Benson and secure the keys to the locked sections of the shelter. The family immediately began releasing the trafficking victims and coordinating an escape plan. The rescue operation was complicated by the fact that many of the victims had been held for extended periods and were in poor physical and psychological condition. Some had been at the facility for months or even years, and several required immediate medical attention. The underground complex was extensive, with multiple levels and numerous holding areas that had to be systematically searched to ensure no victims were left behind. Michael's engineering background proved crucial in navigating the facility's layout and understanding its security systems. The Henderson family and the rescued victims were able to escape the facility during the storm and make their way to emergency services. Sarah, drawing on her teaching experience and knowledge of crisis management, organized the group of survivors and coordinated with Connor and Ashley to provide support and guidance to the younger victims. The group took shelter in a damaged but stable outbuilding on a neighboring property until the storm passed and they could signal for help. Law enforcement response was led by Arkansas State Police Major Crimes Unit Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who coordinated with federal agencies due to the interstate nature of the trafficking operation. The investigation revealed that the Benson property was part of a network spanning multiple states, with connections to similar facilities in Missouri, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. The underground complex contained evidence of hundreds of victims who had been processed through the facility over more than a decade of operation. The forensic investigation, led by FBI Special Agent David Chen, uncovered detailed records that the Bensons had maintained of their operations, including victim information, transport schedules, and financial records showing millions of dollars in trafficking proceeds. The facility had been constructed gradually over many years, with Earl Benson using his background in construction and his knowledge of local geology to create an elaborate underground complex that was virtually undetectable from the surface. The case broke open a much larger trafficking network that had been operating across the rural South, using legitimate businesses, community connections, and geographic isolation to hide extensive criminal operations. The investigation led to arrests in 7 states and the rescue of over 60 additional victims from similar facilities. The Benson case demonstrated how traffickers could exploit community trust, geographic isolation, and infrastructure designed for legitimate purposes to hide crimes occurring literally underground. Both Earl and Martha Benson were convicted on federal trafficking charges and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The investigation revealed that they had been operating their trafficking network for over 15 years, using their reputation as helpful community members to deflect suspicion while running one of the most extensive rural trafficking operations ever discovered in the United States. The Henderson family underwent extensive counseling and therapy following their experience. But they have become advocates for trafficking awareness and rural community safety. Michael has worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for identifying suspicious underground construction in rural areas, while Sarah has developed educational programs for teachers to help identify potential trafficking victims in school settings. The case highlighted the vulnerability of rural communities to organized crime operations that can operate with relative impunity due to geographic isolation and limited law enforcement resources. It also demonstrated how natural disasters and emergency situations can be exploited by criminals as cover for illegal activities, and how community trust and respectability can be weaponized to hide horrific crimes occurring in plain sight. The Benson property has been seized by federal authorities, and the underground facility has been completely excavated and documented as evidence. The site serves as a training facility for law enforcement agencies, learning to identify and investigate rural trafficking operations. The case remains one of the most significant rural human trafficking discoveries in recent U.S. history, revealing the extent to which such operations can hide within seemingly normal communities. Let's move to our 10th story. Our 10th case brings us into the realm of temporal anomalies and psychological mystery, taking place in the Cascade Range of Oregon in August of 2023, where a routine solo hiking trip became a documented case of what appears to be either the most elaborate psychological break ever recorded, or evidence that our understanding of time and causality is fundamentally incomplete. This is the story of Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old emergency room physician from Portland, whose 3-day disappearance resulted in psychiatric evaluations, federal investigation, and ongoing scientific debate about the nature of consciousness and temporal perception. Dr. Walsh was an experienced hiker who regularly used solo wilderness trips as a way to decompress from the intense stress of emergency medicine. She had planned a 4-day solo backpacking trip in the remote wilderness area east of Mount Hood, following established trails through old-growth forest and alpine meadows to a series of remote lakes where she intended to practice wilderness photography and meditation. Walsh was meticulous in her planning, filing detailed itineraries with the Forest Service and maintaining extensive emergency protocols developed over years of solo wilderness experience. On August 15th, Walsh began her hike from the Timberline Trail parking area, carrying professional-grade GPS equipment, satellite communication devices, and enough supplies for 6 days in case of weather delays or route changes. Her planned route would take her approximately 25 miles into the wilderness, with camping stops at designated backcountry sites that required advance permits. Walsh had obtained all necessary permits and had confirmed her itinerary with multiple people, including her supervisor at the hospital and her emergency contact, her sister Maria in Seattle. The first sign of trouble came when Walsh failed to check in via satellite communicator on August 17th, as scheduled in her emergency protocols. When she missed a second scheduled check-in on August 18th, her sister contacted the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office to request a welfare check. Search and rescue operations began immediately, with teams familiar with Walsh's hiking experience and the specific area where she had planned to travel. Walsh was found on August 19th by a search and rescue team led by Deputy Sheriff Marcus Chen. But the circumstances of her discovery were unlike anything the experienced search team had encountered. She was located approximately 12 miles from her planned route, sitting calmly beside an abandoned cabin that wasn't marked on any current maps, but appeared to be in excellent condition despite its apparent age. Walsh was in good physical condition, showing no signs of dehydration, injury, or exposure, despite having been missing for 3 days in challenging wilderness conditions. However, Walsh's mental state was clearly altered in ways that immediately concerned the rescue team. She seemed disoriented about time and location, repeatedly asking what day it was and expressing confusion about how long she had been missing. More disturbing, she demonstrated detailed knowledge about future events that hadn't occurred yet, including specific details about the rescue operation, the identities of team members she had never met, and logistical aspects of the search effort that she shouldn't have known. Deputy Chen's initial field report noted that Walsh appeared to be experiencing what he described as temporal confusion, speaking about past, present, and future events as if they were all occurring simultaneously. She would describe her rescue as if it had already happened multiple times, providing accurate details about procedures and conversations that hadn't yet taken place. When Chen asked her about her missing days, Walsh replied that she had been living the same 3 days over and over, and that she had gotten very good at predicting what everyone would do. The abandoned cabin where Walsh was found became a significant focus of the investigation. The structure appeared to be from the 1940s or 1950s, based on its construction style and materials. But it was in remarkably good condition, considering its apparent age and remote location. The interior was furnished with period-appropriate items and showed signs of recent habitation, including fresh food supplies, clean bedding, and a working wood stove. Most puzzling, the cabin contained personal items that belonged to Walsh, including clothing and equipment that she should still have been carrying in her backpack. Walsh's backpack was found inside the cabin, but its contents didn't match what she should have been carrying according to her packing list. Instead of her planned supplies, the backpack contained items that seemed to be from multiple different trips, some gear that she recognized as belonging to her but hadn't brought on this trip, other equipment that she didn't recognize at all, and food supplies that were different brands and types than what she had purchased for the expedition. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychiatrist specializing in wilderness psychology, was called in to evaluate Walsh following her rescue. Dr. Mitchell's initial assessment noted that Walsh was physically healthy, but exhibiting symptoms consistent with severe temporal disorientation. Walsh consistently described experiencing the same 3-day period repeatedly, with each iteration involving slight variations in events and outcomes. She claimed to have lived through her rescue dozens of times, each time learning more about the process and becoming better at predicting the actions and responses of the rescue team. What made Walsh's case particularly compelling was her ability to demonstrate knowledge that seemed impossible for her to have acquired through normal means. She accurately described the specific search patterns the rescue teams had used, the radio frequencies they had employed, and personal details about team members that she had never met. She knew that Deputy Chen had injured his ankle during the search before he mentioned the injury, and she correctly predicted that the helicopter scheduled to evacuate her would be delayed by exactly 47 minutes due to weather conditions. During her psychiatric evaluation, Walsh provided detailed accounts of her experience that remained consistent across multiple interviews conducted over several weeks. She described arriving at the cabin on what she believed was her second day of hiking, finding it fully furnished and apparently waiting for her arrival. According to Walsh, she spent the first night at the cabin normally, sleeping well and planning to continue her hike the next morning. However, when she woke up, it was the same day again, with the same weather conditions, the same wildlife activity, and the same sequence of events occurring exactly as they had the day before. Walsh claimed that each repetition of the 3-day cycle allowed her to explore different choices and outcomes while retaining memory of previous iterations. She described systematically testing different decisions and actions to see how they affected subsequent events, gradually building an understanding of the temporal loop she found herself trapped within. According to her account, she had eventually learned to predict not only natural events like weather patterns and animal behavior, but also human actions, including the search and rescue operation that would eventually find her. The investigation expanded to include Dr. Robert Chen, a physicist specializing in temporal mechanics, who analyzed Walsh's claims from a theoretical physics perspective. While Dr. Chen acknowledged that Walsh's descriptions were consistent with certain theoretical models of closed time-like curves and temporal loops, he noted that there was no known mechanism that could create such phenomena in natural conditions. However, he couldn't explain how Walsh had acquired the specific knowledge she demonstrated about future events and people she had never encountered. The abandoned cabin investigation revealed additional puzzles that complicated attempts to explain Walsh's experience through conventional psychology. Forest Service records showed no permits or documentation for any structure in that location, and historical surveys of the area dating back to the 1920s showed no evidence that a cabin had ever been built there. However, the cabin's construction style and materials were consistent with 1940s building techniques, and the furnishings appeared to be authentic period pieces rather than modern reproductions. More disturbing, when investigators attempted to locate the cabin for follow-up investigation, they were unable to find it. GPS coordinates from the rescue operation led to an empty clearing where the cabin should have been located. Ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment found no evidence that any structure had ever existed at that location. The cabin seemed to have vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving only Walsh's testimony and the rescue team's photographs as evidence of its existence. Walsh underwent extensive medical and psychological testing over the course of several months. Brain imaging studies showed no evidence of neurological damage. Drug screening found no evidence of hallucinogenic substances, and comprehensive psychological evaluation indicated no signs of psychosis or other mental health conditions that could explain her experiences. Her cognitive function was normal. Her memory was intact for events before and after her wilderness experience, and she showed no signs of the dissociation or reality distortion typically associated with severe psychological breaks. Dr. Mitchell's final psychiatric report concluded that Walsh was experiencing what she termed persistent temporal displacement syndrome, a condition she had never encountered before, but which seemed to involve the retention of memories from experiences that either hadn't occurred or had occurred outside normal temporal sequence. While Dr. Mitchell couldn't rule out elaborate psychological explanations for Walsh's condition, she noted that the specificity and accuracy of Walsh's predictive knowledge suggested either an unprecedented form of psychological phenomenon or the operation of mechanisms that weren't yet understood by conventional science. Walsh returned to work as an emergency room physician, but found that her temporal displacement experience had given her an unusual advantage in her medical practice. She began demonstrating an uncanny ability to predict patient outcomes, complications, and responses to treatment with accuracy far exceeding normal medical intuition. Her colleagues noted that she seemed to know how medical situations would develop before conventional diagnostic information was available, leading to improved patient care, but also raising questions about the source of her predictive abilities. The case attracted attention from researchers studying consciousness, temporal perception, and anomalous psychological phenomena. Walsh has participated in ongoing studies designed to test her predictive abilities under controlled conditions, and results have consistently shown performance significantly above statistical chance. However, the mechanism behind her abilities remains unexplained, and debate continues about whether her experience represents a psychological phenomenon, a genuine temporal anomaly, or something else entirely. Walsh maintains that she continues to experience residual effects from her time loop experience, including occasional episodes where she feels as though she's reliving moments she's experienced before. She describes these episodes as brief but vivid sensations of temporal repetition, as if certain moments in her daily life are echoing previous iterations she lived through during her 3 days at the mysterious cabin. The case has become a subject of ongoing scientific interest, with researchers from multiple disciplines studying Walsh's experience and its implications for understanding consciousness, memory, and temporal perception. While no definitive explanation has emerged, the case represents one of the most thoroughly documented instances of reported temporal anomaly experience, supported by multiple witness testimony, physical evidence, and extensive medical and psychological evaluation. Let's move to our 11th and final story. Our final case brings us to the Canadian Rockies of Alberta in November of 2024, where an experienced wilderness survivalist's desperate calls for help were received by ham radio operators across North America, creating one of the most documented yet unexplained rescue scenarios in modern history. This is the account of Thomas Mitchell, a 43-year-old former military communications specialist turned wilderness guide, whose 5-day ordeal at a remote cabin became a mystery that challenges everything we think we know about communication, isolation, and the boundaries between life and death. Mitchell was an expert in wilderness survival and backcountry communication systems, with over 20 years of experience guiding clients through some of Canada's most challenging terrain. He had served as a radio operator in the Canadian Armed Forces before transitioning to civilian wilderness guiding, and his technical expertise with communication equipment made him one of the most sought-after guides for expeditions into truly remote areas. Mitchell was also a licensed amateur radio operator with the call sign VE6TMM, and he maintained regular contact with a network of ham radio enthusiasts across North America who relied on his wilderness reports and emergency coordination capabilities. In November of 2024, Mitchell planned a solo winter assessment trip to evaluate a remote cabin in Jasper National Park for potential use in future guided expeditions. The cabin was located approximately 60 kilometers from the nearest road, accessible only by snowmobile or cross-country skiing during winter months. Mitchell intended to spend a week at the location, testing the cabin's winter habitability, evaluating emergency communication options, and documenting conditions for his guiding business. He carried professional-grade radio equipment, including a high-frequency transceiver capable of long-distance communication and emergency beacon systems designed for wilderness rescue operations. Mitchell's emergency began on November 18th, when ham radio operators across Western Canada began receiving distress calls on multiple frequencies from call sign VE6TMM. The initial transmissions, received by operators in Calgary, Vancouver, and Edmonton simultaneously, reported that Mitchell was trapped at the remote cabin by an early-season blizzard and was requesting weather updates and emergency coordination. The calls were clear, strong, and consistent with Mitchell's normal radio procedures, including proper authentication codes and technical details that confirmed the transmissions were coming from his equipment. What made these initial calls noteworthy was their technical characteristics. Mitchell's signal was being received across an unusually wide geographic area, with signal strength that suggested he was using much more powerful equipment than his portable wilderness setup should have been capable of producing. Ham radio operators noted that the signal propagation patterns were inconsistent with normal atmospheric conditions, and several operators reported that Mitchell's transmissions were coming through more clearly than local stations operating at much higher power levels. Over the following days, the nature of Mitchell's transmissions became increasingly disturbing. On November 19th, operators began receiving calls where Mitchell described being surrounded by something he couldn't identify, using technical language that suggested he was tracking movement around the cabin with electronic equipment. Mitchell reported detecting multiple large heat signatures circling the property, and described sounds that he couldn't match to any known wildlife species. His transmissions maintained their professional military precision, but the content suggested he was facing a threat that was escalating rapidly. Ham radio operator Jennifer Walsh in Calgary, who had maintained regular contact with Mitchell for several years, noted that his November 19th transmissions included technical details about his situation that seemed impossible given his equipment limitations. Mitchell described using thermal imaging and motion detection systems that he shouldn't have had access to at the remote location, and he provided detailed environmental readings, including barometric pressure, humidity, and temperature data with precision that suggested professional meteorological equipment rather than basic wilderness gear. The situation became more alarming on November 20th, when Mitchell's transmissions began describing a coordinated assault on the cabin by entities he still couldn't identify. His calls included tactical language from his military background, describing defensive positions, perimeter breaches, and coordinated movement patterns that suggested he was facing an organized attack. Mitchell's radio procedure remained perfect throughout these transmissions, maintaining proper call signs, frequency protocols, and emergency codes, even as he described increasingly desperate circumstances. Multiple ham radio operators recorded these transmissions, and analysis of the recordings revealed technical anomalies that communications experts found impossible to explain. The signal characteristics showed that Mitchell's radio was operating at power levels far exceeding its design specifications, and the clarity of his transmissions suggested he was using professional broadcasting equipment rather than portable wilderness gear. More puzzling, frequency analysis showed that the transmissions were coming through on multiple bands simultaneously, something that would require sophisticated frequency management equipment that Mitchell definitely wasn't carrying. On November 21st, Mitchell's transmissions took on an even more disturbing character as he began describing the entities surrounding the cabin in detail. According to his reports, he was facing multiple, large, intelligent beings that demonstrated tactical coordination and appeared to be testing the cabin's defenses systematically. Mitchell described sounds that suggested the entities were communicating with each other using complex vocalizations, and he reported evidence that they were using tools or technology to attempt to breach the cabin's walls and roof. Ham radio operators noted that Mitchell's November 21st transmissions included information that he shouldn't have been able to acquire through normal observation. He provided detailed descriptions of the entity's movement patterns extending far beyond what should have been visible from the cabin, and he demonstrated knowledge of their tactical planning that suggested either impossibly acute observation skills or access to information through means that weren't apparent. Mitchell's descriptions were consistent and technically precise, but they described a situation that seemed to exceed the boundaries of known wildlife behavior or human threat scenarios. The most chilling transmissions came on November 22nd, when Mitchell began reporting that the entities had found a way to interfere with his communications and were monitoring his radio traffic. He described discovering that his emergency beacon had been disabled by external interference, and that his radio equipment was showing signs of deliberate sabotage. Mitchell's transmissions became more sporadic and included reports that the entities were somehow jamming his communications attempts while simultaneously allowing certain transmissions to go through, as if they were controlling his ability to call for help. Emergency response coordination was complicated by the remote location and severe weather conditions that prevented helicopter or ground rescue operations. Parks Canada initiated rescue protocols, but the earliest possible rescue date was estimated at November 25th due to blizzard conditions and the technical challenges of reaching Mitchell's location. Ham radio operators maintained continuous monitoring schedules, providing the only communication link to Mitchell and documenting his situation for emergency services. Mitchell's final coherent transmissions came on November the 23rd. when he reported that the cabin's defenses had been breached and that he was preparing for direct confrontation with the entities. His last clear transmission, recorded by operators in Vancouver and Seattle simultaneously, included the words, "They're inside now, and I don't think. They're what I thought they were, and the equipment is showing readings that don't make sense. And if anyone receives this, tell my sister in Toronto that the cabin wasn't empty when I arrived." The transmission ended abruptly with what sounded like equipment failure rather than normal shutdown procedures. However, the mystery deepened when ham radio operators continued receiving transmissions from Mitchell's call sign for several hours after his final coherent message. These later transmissions consisted primarily of technical data, weather readings, equipment status reports, and location coordinates, transmitted in Mitchell's voice, but using automated procedures that suggested computer-generated speech rather than live communication. The technical data being transmitted was more detailed and precise than Mitchell's portable equipment should have been capable of generating. The rescue team, led by Parks Canada Warden Sarah Chen, finally reached Mitchell's location on November 25th and made a discovery that contradicted everything the ham radio transmissions had suggested. The remote cabin was completely empty and showed no signs of recent occupation. Mitchell's equipment was nowhere to be found. His planned supplies were not present, and there was no evidence that anyone had been at the location for weeks or possibly months. The cabin was in good condition, with no signs of damage, forced entry, or defensive preparations. Even more puzzling, the rescue team's investigation revealed that the cabin had been locked and secured when they arrived, with no indication that anyone had accessed it recently. Snow patterns around the building showed no footprints, vehicle tracks, or other signs of human activity. The rescue team found no evidence of Mitchell's presence, no abandoned equipment, and no signs of the siege-like conditions he had described in his radio transmissions. A comprehensive search of the surrounding area found no trace of Mitchell, his equipment, or any evidence that he had ever reached the planned location. His snowmobile was eventually located at the trailhead, where he had planned to begin his trip, still loaded with supplies and showing no signs of having been used. Mitchell's personal vehicle was found in the parking area, exactly where he had left it, with no indication that he had begun his planned expedition. The investigation expanded to include technical analysis of the ham radio transmissions, led by Communications Research Centre Canada specialist Dr. Michael Torres. Dr. Torres confirmed that the transmissions had definitely originated from Mitchell's radio equipment using his proper call sign and authentication codes. But signal analysis revealed characteristics that were impossible to explain. The transmissions had signal strength and propagation characteristics that would have required either much more powerful equipment than Mitchell was carrying, or atmospheric conditions that hadn't existed during the time period in question. Most significantly, Dr. Torres discovered that the transmissions had been received over a period of 5 days, but cellular tower data and GPS tracking from Mitchell's emergency devices showed that he had never left the trailhead area. According to electronic evidence, Mitchell had remained in the parking area for less than 2 hours on November 18th before returning home to Calgary. Yet, ham radio operators had continued, receiving transmissions from his equipment for 4 additional days from a location 60 kilometers away. The case attracted attention from researchers studying anomalous communication phenomena and unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas. Mitchell's experience represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases of impossible communication events. With multiple independent witnesses, technical recordings, and forensic analysis that confirms the reality of the transmissions while simultaneously proving that the described events couldn't have occurred as reported. Thomas Mitchell has never been located, despite extensive search efforts and ongoing investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. His radio equipment has never been recovered, and no explanation has been found for how transmissions continued from his call sign after electronic evidence proves he had returned home. The case remains active with Parks Canada and the RCMP, representing one of the most puzzling disappearance cases in Canadian history. The implications of Mitchell's case extend beyond simple, unexplained disappearance into questions about the nature of communication, consciousness, and reality itself. The documented evidence suggests that somehow transmissions were received from Mitchell's radio equipment describing events that either didn't happen or happened in a way that exceeds our understanding of physical possibility. What makes this case our most unsettling is how it challenges the boundary between the explainable and the impossible. Mitchell's transmissions were technically perfect. His descriptions were detailed and consistent, and his situation was documented by multiple independent observers. Yet the physical evidence proves that none of what he described could have actually occurred in the way he reported it. As we close this collection of disturbing cabin encounters, remember that truth is often stranger than fiction, and that the wilderness holds secrets that we're only beginning to understand. Some questions don't have answers. Some mysteries resist explanation. And sometimes the most terrifying thing is not knowing whether what we've experienced is real or something else entirely. If you've made it this far into these 11 terrifying accounts, you're clearly someone who appreciates the darker mysteries that lurk in the shadows of our world. These stories represent just a fraction of the unexplained encounters, documented mysteries, and terrifying experiences that occur in remote locations every year. For more deep dives into the cases that keep investigators awake at night, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell. We're constantly researching new cases, interviewing witnesses, and uncovering the documentation behind the stories that others are afraid to tell. Don't let fear stop you from seeking the truth. Subscribe now and join our community of people who aren't afraid to look into the darkness and ask the questions that others won't. Your next nightmare might just be one click away.